Is that Mike? Yes, there we go. There we go.
I'm testing. I think this mic is.
Oh, yeah, I do hear it. Go ahead.
Can you hear? Good.
Okay, I need these. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ann Avalon. I'm the director for the Office of Social Justice and Respect Life at the Archdiocese. And I'm very happy to be with you all this evening. I hope as you've gathered that you have been able to get a copy of the summary. If you don't have one yet, it's a single sheet. Raise your hand, and we have people who will keep your hand raised until you get it, and we have people who will help give you one. Also, we have copies available for free for taking of the whole pastoral letter for Archbishop. If you would like that as well, keep your hand raised and we'll get one to you. I'll give you a minute to get those.
And also, there's seats that go in the front.
Yes, there are seats in the front. If somebody would like to be seated in the front, you are welcome to do that. Thank you. Okay, I think everybody's got, there's one more here. This gentleman needs a booklet, the actual pastoral letter book. There are two here in the front. Here, you can have mine. Sure. And you'll get one here. Raise your hand. Raise your hands if you want the book. We'll get them to you. Okay. Is that better? Okay, I need to use my outdoor voice. I'm sorry, I was a little shy there. If you don't have either a booklet or a summary sheet, raise your hand, keep it raised until you get what you need, and we'll get it to you. And people feel it can help pass them inward. Wonderful. Okay, we're getting there. As we're getting the booklets and the summary sheets to everyone, I want to begin by saying on January 11th of this year, Archbishop Wester published a groundbreaking pastoral letter, Living in the Light of Christ's Peace, a conversation toward nuclear disarmament. In this letter, if you haven't already read it, he recognizes the importance of this moment right now, right here, for dialogue. Following Pope Francis's example and his recent statements about the immorality of even possessing nuclear weapons. Archbishop also calls us to a renewed, sustained, and serious conversation in New Mexico and beyond regarding universal, verifiable nuclear disarmament. Not a light topic, not one that we run to seek out often, but one that is important and essential for our time right now. Today, on the 77th anniversary of the U.S. atomic bombing of Nagasaki, we gather to pray and to continue that conversation with local faith leaders. We hope that this is the first of many such dialogues in faith communities, in churches, in families, in cities across our state and nation. As Pope Francis recently called our church to a process of synodality, which is a big word for dialogue, Archbishop follows Pope Francis's example in calling us to dialogue and to listen to one another from the heart about difficult issues, about challenging topics. Tonight we've invited a number of faith leaders who I will introduce in a moment. And I want to again reiterate that one of our panelists was not able to be with us today because she is a part, Samia Ased is a part of the Islamic Center of New Mexico in Albuquerque, and it's her community that's directly impacted by the murders. And they are actually holding a prayer service at this moment at the community there. And so we hold them in solidarity, and she asked us to pray with her and for them during our time together. So we will have Archbishop Wester along with, I want to, when I introduce people, I'm not going to do the entire, everybody's bio. On the summary sheet that you all, the one pager that hopefully you all had, if you flip that over, there are bios for our panelists. Starting with Talitha Arnold, who is a senior minister of the United Church of Santa Fe, joining us. And next to her, we have the former governor of Cochiti Pueblo, Mr. Regis Pecos. Welcome. And Archbishop Wester. And next to Archbishop Wester, we have the Reverend Dr. Holly Beaumont with us. And we have Roshi Joan Halifax from the Upaya Zen Center with us. So this is our panel, our dialogue. We hope for some good interaction. I will give a little guidance here of what we're going to do so we know what's going to come. We have some questions that we've posed to the panelists, and I will repeat those questions now so that you hear those and that the panelists hear those. And I'll give each panelist about 3 minutes or so to respond to each of our questions. And we'll just go through the questions in that manner. And then after we finish those 3 rounds, I will invite just open conversation and dialogue among the panelists so that they can ask each other questions, comment, that kind of thing. All through this process, I invite you, hopefully, I don't know if they've been given out yet, but if they haven't, I want to make sure you have, if you wish, index cards. We will provide index cards to each of you. If you don't have them yet, maybe we can start passing them along the edges of the pews, and we have some pencils as well if you need. And what I invite you to do is as the panelists are answering questions and dialoguing, I invite you, if you have a question or a comment directed to any of the panelists, or perhaps just a question for any of the panelists, just in general, to write it down. And we are going to take those questions, and then I will ask them. We're going to sort through them and see how our time goes and try to cover as many as we can. So if at any point you need a index card or a pencil, let our ushers know here, and also we have pencils if you need. So hopefully with those directions we're ready to start. We also hope to wrap up by 7:45 to 8, somewhere in that range. We'll see how our conversation goes. And we understand if people have to leave, that's fine, but just know that's about the time we're aiming for. So, Archbishop Wester, let's see. Let me. I also wanted to note, I forgot to say this, that our dialogue is being live streamed as well. So there is an audience that is with us virtually, so we welcome you as well. And I don't think we have a way to receive your questions, but again, we hope that this is the first of many dialogues. So these are the 3 questions that we've posed to stimulate our conversation. How does your particular faith tradition guide you and others to a world free of nuclear weapons? Why is this so urgent for our world at this moment? That's question 1. This has a little background for question 2. Robert McNamara, the defense secretary during the Cuban Missile Crisis, said that the human race survived only by luck. The second nuclear arms race is arguably even more dangerous because of all the cyber and hypersonic weapons, the growing use of artificial intelligence, and the multiple potential adversaries. We no longer just have one adversary, we have many. So the question in there is, what are your own views on the need for universal verifiable nuclear disarmament? And how do we begin to get there? What's the path? And the third question that we've posed is, again, something Archbishop referenced in his homily, that the New Mexico delegation, congressional delegation, frequently promotes nuclear weapons programs for much needed jobs. And we know our state needs sustainable jobs for New Mexico. Yet the land of enchantment always gets stuck at the bottom. So what are your views on transitioning from nuclear weapons production and a focus on that at the labs to other projects? How can New Mexico better diversify its economy and even the goals of the labs, for that matter, to create more jobs outside of the nuclear weapons industry? So that's our scope of questions. So with that said, I'd like to invite Archbishop Wester to start us off with a few reflections on your pastoral letter.
Thank you very much. So from our particular faith tradition, it's not working, is it? Are my glasses working? Oh, I have to turn it on. Novel. Thank you. How's that? There we go. My glasses, yeah, that's why I have to wear glasses. So do you want me to do all three of them now, or I'll just start off and then we'll go on, yeah. So I'll break the ice, so to speak. From the Catholic Christian faith tradition is rooted in the gospel. So the scriptures are our foundation. And we believe that the gospels are a gospel of nonviolence. I realize that so many of you are very actively living lives of nonviolence. You're promoting nonviolence, you're protesting in peaceful ways to promote nonviolence. So this is something that's very much a part of our gospel. We are sometimes, though, victims of yeah, but. One of our deacons was talking about yeah, but. I said, what's a yeah, but? He said, yeah, comma, but. Yeah, we believe in a gospel of peace, but what about deterrence? Or we believe in this, but what about that? And I think, sadly, over the centuries, we've watered down the gospel and its message of peace. And so I see our tradition really sparking the essence of the gospel, and that Christ called us as Christians to be instruments of peace, as St. Francis put in his famous prayer. So that would be the grounding. Another element is that, get that second question in there, why are we going against nuclear weapons? Well, obviously, we cannot have peace living under the shadow of nuclear weapons. As we know, we are the only country that's used nuclear weapons in a war. We know that there are accidents. We know that there are miscommunications. A dear friend of mine always said that the inevitable outcome of all human communication is partial misunderstanding. Sometimes that could be that over dinner, you might not quite understand each other. If that misunderstanding is on an international level, and you have people pushing nuclear bomb buttons, that could be devastating for the entire planet. So the point is that we need to rid our planet of nuclear weapons because of the potential for destroying the planet and the human race, period, as we know it. The scriptures talk a lot about right relationships. You can't have right relationships if we don't exist. The nuclear weapons live in their silos, and we therefore have to live in our silos. Silos of saying, well, we have to defend ourselves, or we have to protect ourselves, or whatever it may be. When in reality, a lot of the nuclear weapons really don't make us safe. As a matter of fact, they make us far more dangerous. The world's a far more dangerous place because of them. And furthermore, there's also the element of the money that's made off of them, the industry, the money behind the nuclear weapons. So all of this has to be looked at, I think, very soberly and really from our faith perspective. And finally, I would say, too, that the gospel is one of inclusivity. For us, Christ came to gather together the nations, to gather people together so that we could all be one in harmony. This was really the focus of Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, when he talked about our common home and that we all live together as one human family and we have to care for our home. But how can we care for our home realistically when we've created these bombs? We have reduced them now, that's true, because over the last few decades, but we still have way too many. They estimate about 13,000 throughout the world. I think I'm right on that. And not only that, but it's not just a numbers game. Even if we reduce the numbers, it's the qualitative issue that must be looked at. The nuclear weapons we have today are far more lethal, far more accurate, with far better delivery systems. So we could have fewer numbers of missiles, but their lethality is even greater than if we had thousands or more. So from our perspective, this is something that we have to work toward because of the gospel of peace, because of the right relationships, and because of the threat that these pose to our inclusivity, to our inclusivity. I think that the goal of our pastoral letter was to start a conversation. That's why I'm so thrilled about tonight, that this is a chance for us to have a conversation. And everybody's invited, and everybody who has a point of view on this matter is invited. We want to hear from everybody, because it's when we talk together, my conviction is that if we really come with an open mind and an open heart and want to learn, that conversation will inevitably and inexorably lead us to the disarmament and to a greater sense of peace. So that's in a nutshell, I think, how I would put it. Thank you.
Thank you, Archbishop, for kicking us off here. I wanted to invite Joan, if you would reflect with us on that first question. How does your faith tradition guide you to a world free of nuclear weapons?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. A little bit, all right. So I will try to speak slowly. In the mid-1960s, I was so fortunate to encounter a very remarkable teacher, a monk from Vietnam. And he had come. Hello, okay, here we are. He had come to our country to urge us, to beg us to stop bombing his country, Vietnam. Well, I turned 80 last week, so I was in my 20s when I met Thai. And I realized that I could be a social activist, an environmental activist, and a contemplative. Thich Nhat Hanh exemplified these deep qualities of commitment to end violence in this world. He also had exemplified, as I encountered him when he was such a young man, of what it meant to actually be a person of peace. Not only about peacemaking, but being peace. So we could ask, what does this tradition of Buddhism offer us? It offers us, if you will, a path to being peace, in fact. It also has, in the Mahayana tradition, a very powerful archetype that I think is reflected in the person of Jesus. And that archetype is the archetype of the Bodhisattva. It is someone who is choosing not to kind of get off the wheel, so to speak, and just go into the Pure Land. But like Thich Nhat Hanh, like Nelson Mandela, like Malala, and I would say like you, Archbishop Wester, someone who has chosen a path that is completely committed, completely dedicated to ending suffering in this world. And that archetype, if you will, overlights the Buddhism that Thich Nhat Hanh brought to this country. And I would also just suggest that the Eightfold Path, you know, the Four Noble Truths, the sort of core teaching of the Buddha, there is this, the first truth is that we really need to look deeply at the roots of our suffering and at the truth of suffering in our world and in our very lives. There's a wonderful line I quote from the Transmission of Light by Zen Master Keizan, which says, "Do not find fault with the present." And most people go, whoa, that I find a lot of fault with the present. But what Keizan is saying is this. He is saying, see it. Do not flee it. Perceive it deeply. And this is the first noble truth, seeing deeply the truth of suffering, and the second noble truth, the roots of suffering. And we can allocate blame to our institutions, our governments, patriarchy, hierarchy, and so forth. But in actuality, the roots of suffering are right in our human experience. See it deeply. This is what Thai meant by being peace. And the third noble truth is that we can actually free ourselves from distorted views that are self-centered and destructive. And the fourth is this path, the path out of suffering. So in listening to you as you spoke today, I was so deeply moved because what I heard was courage. I heard strong back, that is this resoluteness, this strength that allows you to uphold yourself in the midst of the very complex conditions of our era. And by the same token, great compassion, soft front, the balance between these qualities of deep equanimity and deep love and compassion. And I will confess something to you, and I'm kind of ashamed. It's my first time of stepping into God's church here. And I was so uplifted, and I had tears in my eyes. And I just thank you for inviting me into God's church, because I truly felt the presence of God through your words, but also the field of the congregation, you know, what you brought. And so I believe that the good news is you, not just you. Thank you.
Holly, would you like to carry on? Go ahead.
I'm the Reverend Holly Beaumont, and I just want to say another word about who I am, because Ann didn't give me any of that. I'm the organizing director of Interfaith Worker Justice New Mexico, which is a statewide network of people of faith and people of conscience who advocate for workers' rights and economic justice. And prior to that, I was the legislative advocate for the Conference of Churches, which is the point at which I got really immersed in the issue of nuclear weapons in New Mexico. And prior to that, I came here over 35 years ago to revitalize a small blue-collar church here in Santa Fe. And my church, like just about every congregation, certainly in northern New Mexico, had congregants who worked at the lab or in some way were on the payroll of this industry. And I want to acknowledge one of the members, Nancy Scher, who was a loyal and dedicated servant who just recently died after a long battle with very rare cancers. And Nancy worked at LANL, and she worked in the plutonium facility, dismantling weapons and moving the plutonium from the weapons in some way, and that's all I understand. So I just want to remember Nancy. My faith tradition is the faith tradition of John Lewis. We are called by Jesus of Nazareth to make good trouble. And we are doing that. One of my colleagues is the Reverend William Barber with the Poor People's Campaign. And we are affiliated with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, which was a frontier movement across this nation that decided to reject the confines of denominational polity and creedalism, and said that anyone who feels called by God and is baptized is welcome into this new movement, and that's who we are. It is my belief that Jesus of Nazareth called us to challenge the powers and principalities of empire and to recover and restore the blessings of God for the people of God, and that's what we do. I think that the statements that have come out of our traditions are very important. Archbishop Wester's statement is very important and necessary. And the reason I believe in that is because these statements frame the collective experience of the people of God and hopefully express them in a moral, ethical, and theological language that informs and inspires us. And they are very important, and in this day and age, they're more important than ever because the only voices of faith, people of faith, that we seem to be hearing right now are the shrill voices of my opposition. And there is a reason for that. It is very, very difficult for progressive faith leaders to have their voices heard. So I want today to use this time to remind you that the people of New Mexico have been very busy. And faith leaders across this country have been very busy at responding to and addressing the issue of nuclear weapons, going all the way back to right after 1945. There was a renaissance in the 1980s, and then now. And is that my time? So I'm going to be referencing some of these letters later and statements, and I'm hoping that you will, in fact, find them and use them for your own purposes. Before we continue, I lost the mic there. I don't know what happened. There we go, maybe. Before we continue, I would like to remind you all to write your questions. Sorry, my white mic isn't working. Write your questions and pass them to the ends of the pews, and we will collect them. And as we finish here, we'll read some of them. Thank you.
Goa Shatse, Shakoya, Oha Marstan, Hati Zikuta, Seom, Kuhu, Ho at the Kaship Ani Garstio, Natuna, you eat a church, 8 shall new hours go up money. In my first language of Charis, gifted to me by the people of Cochiti, where I was born and raised, Our elders teach us to greet people with an expression of love, respect, and compassion. And so that is how I greeted you, because that is the core of my dual faith. I come from one of the surviving 24 indigenous nations of these lands, surviving colonialism. And in the horrific and traumatic history of relations, I am centered by the teachings of Pope Francis that the greatest expression of love is forgiveness. And our ancestors forgave what was part of the horrific past to embrace Catholicism. So I'm a person of faith of this church, and also a son of the faith of our indigenous ways, centered on the core values of love, respect, compassion, peace, and justice. So when we come to the place of worship, like we are here in this beautiful Cathedral of St. Francis, in our efforts to fulfill becoming the instruments of peace, to be in this place under the watchful eyes of Our Lady of Peace. Those are the common core values that we share from whatever denomination we come from, that brings us as children of faith together. And so every time we come into the place of worship, we offer one another peace. We engage in the act of contrition for the things that we have failed to do, to say in how we behave toward one another. So for me, to be consistent with that dual faith gifted to me, and as I worship, to be consistent with my faith, I have to speak and I have to act consistent with those teachings that have blessed me in my life, my family, and my community, to extend, as all prayers do, to give to all of you peace, to give all of you a sense of love and respect and compassion, as central to what we share as being a family of humankind. And so if I am to fulfill my duty and sacred trust, I have to speak out against what threatens humanity. I must act consistent with my faith, to act against the things that threaten our humanity. And I want to just share, while a young lady in the back, Dr. Mariah Gomez, who is nurturing a precious gift, the youngest among us in this gathering, Mariquita, is answering me in my recognition of her by asking each and every one of us, what do we want to gift all future generations from this time as we gather and share what matters most to us, to speak against the threats of annihilation in a nuclear war. But I would remind all of us that while that is a threat that we must speak out against, act against that very threat. I challenge us at the most personal level to ask ourselves, how do we live each day? Do we live each day consistent with the core values of our faith of love and respect and compassion for one another? Because what will annihilate us sooner than a nuclear war and the threats of that devastation is our personal failures in how our attitudes define our behaviors toward one another every day, every minute, every hour, to be kind and respectful and loving to one another. And why is this important? Because that is what threatens us before we will be annihilated by a nuclear war, is how we are consistent or inconsistent, guided by our faith. And so I ask, with the beautiful, precious gift of Marakita in the back, what are we going to give to her and all future generations that is defined by our attitudes and behaviors today toward one another? For me, that is what centers me to work towards creating a place that we enjoy every day of our lives, and towards being free from the shackles of annihilating one another by how we act and behave toward one another.
Important, yes. Thank you. Important reflections about how we are to treat one another with civility and thinking about future generations. Talitha, would you like to?
Thank you. Thank you very much for that witness. Thank you, Archbishop, for your powerful and grounded statement and the courage to offer it not only in January, but to make sure that it keeps getting offered. And for pulling all of us together from all the different traditions that we have. Holly, thank you for your ongoing witness with your work with the Downwinders and all throughout the time that we've known each other as ministers, as ordained women. Your work for justice for all people and especially for workers is important. And Joan, it is wonderful finally to meet you in person. We admired your work from afar, and it is truly an honor to be on this panel with you. So thank you again, Anne and Archbishop, for getting us all together in one way or the other, and helping us to find that common ground among all of our different traditions as well. I'm the Reverend Talitha Arnold. I'm the senior minister at the United Church of Santa Fe, which is a United Church of Christ. Our tradition goes back to the congregational tradition, the folks who broke away from the Church of England, who had broken away from the Catholic Church. But the early Congregationalists put a real emphasis on the local congregation, and not only lay people, not only clergy, but also lay people finding their voices, reading that Bible, and determining the essence of faith, not just for themselves individually, but also in covenant communities as congregations. And so it is in that tradition that I also thank Archbishop Wester for reminding me and reminding all other Christians, whatever our background, whether we're Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox, or all the various blendings thereof, of what really is the essence of the faith. That peace is not just an add-on. Peace is not just something that we offer to one another casually on a Sunday morning or whenever we gather for worship. That peace is the very essence of the one in whose footsteps we try to follow. That if we understand Jesus Christ as the Prince of Peace, then that means those of us who take the name of Christian have to be about that peace as well. And that also there is never peace without justice, which is another fundamental aspect of what Jesus of Nazareth was all about. That it wasn't just a matter of saying peace, peace when there is no peace, but also that he reflected his very deep Jewish roots. That yes, he was a person of peace, but he also was a person who was shaped by the prophet Isaiah and that vision of turning swords into plowshares. And he was a person who was shaped by the vision of Habakkuk, however you pronounce that name, who said, write the vision, write it big enough so that all can see. And Archbishop, you have, I was going to say laid down the gauntlet. I'm not sure that's the best metaphor. You have written that vision large, and the rest of us cannot turn away from it, no matter what our tradition is. So I thank you for reminding me, calling me and other Christians to account. And I thank you, Regis, for calling those of us who live in northern New Mexico, whether we go back hundreds of generations or whether or not we're relatively newcomers, have only been here for a few decades, but also reminding us of the essence of this land and of the people who have lived here for hundreds of generations. Your words about that you greeted us as we are to greet all people with love, respect, and compassion, and to find the common ground among all of our various traditions. What does the United Church of Christ bring to this conversation that might be perhaps somewhat unique? Definitely the emphasis on the congregation, and that it is the responsibility of the whole people, not just your ordained clergy, not just those of us who get to dress up in fancy clothes, but the whole people to speak out, to claim this faith, and to be about this important work. And also the United Church of Christ, the congregational tradition, was the first Protestant denomination, at least, to make a link in terms of justice, peace, and environmental racism. That in the early 1980s, in a small African-American town in North Carolina, where an industry was going to dump their PCP waste in that community, the congregational churches, both white and African-American, of that North Carolina region, banded together to show that this was injustice and it was environmental racism. And the United Church of Christ in those early 80s was the first denomination to take two maps. One was a map of the United States showing communities of color and communities of poverty, and the other was a map showing where nuclear waste, hazardous waste, chemical waste, all the environmental waste that we generate as a country, where those waste dumps were located. And they overlaid the waste map over the other map and showed definitively that 99% of all waste dumps are dumped on communities of color and communities of poverty. And that began the environmental racism movement, or the calling out environmental racism in this country. And so it is truly an honor to be with you all today, because we've already witnessed to the Tularosa downwinders. We also know that other communities throughout northern New Mexico, southern New Mexico, central New Mexico serve as the dumping grounds for nuclear waste and all other kinds of environmental waste. And all of you have called me to account once again to claim that heritage and get back to work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Talitha. So we've heard some of the roots of our faith traditions represented here. That of right relationships, of getting at the roots of suffering, of expressions of forgiveness, coupled with responsibility for each other. A view for knowing what we're doing for the next generations, a call to care for those who come in the future, laying healthy ground for them, that we are rooted in peace and justice, and that we're all, every single one of us and everyone you know is called to this work. Even though it seems daunting, we're all called. And I think another important point of our faith is bringing up the connection to the land and environmental racism and poverty. All of those issues overlay. So thank you. I want to move on to our next question, which is, what are your views on the need for universal, verifiable nuclear disarmament? That's a big mouthful. But as when I have mentioned this before, people say, well, you can't just, get rid of your nuclear weapons because somebody else is going to have them. And that's true. We do need disarmament on all sides. So that's what universal, verifiable, meaning we can tell that countries and entities are disarming, but that we get there to be verified. So what are your views? How do we get there? So I think this time I'll start, Holly, would you like to start us off on this one? And I'll kind of move around.
Thank you, Jesus. You're going to be first one time. So, I love these questions. I actually said to Anne, I want the questions beforehand because this is not a quiz show, and we want to be prepared. I think for all of us, we are living in an existential moment when we are at a stalemate with the other nuclear power in this world over Ukraine. And if this is not just an absolutely vivid and existential example of why nuclear weapons are one of the great, how do we say it, scams of governments in our history, this should be that moment, because we are in a stalemate with Putin, and it is preventing us from addressing what is genocide, and in very similar biblical way, this marching the people of Ukraine off to be held in Russia is reminiscent of the biblical history of Israel. And we can't do anything to save our brothers and sisters because we're terrified that we will trigger the next war, and it will be a nuclear war. And so we are up against the reality of what good are nuclear weapons. We can't use them against terrorists, as someone said. We can't use them. It is patently immoral to use them against a nation that doesn't have them. And it is suicidal to use them against a nation that does have them. So why do we have them? But I would say that while we're on one level talking about the potential destruction of nuclear weapons, we have the unique honor of living in the state where this all began. And I think after 35 years of living in New Mexico and bringing memorials to the state legislature every session year after year, which were passed unanimously, calling on Congress to support the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which I want to talk more about. At every session, every legislative session, when we would present our memorial in a committee hearing, someone on that committee, an elected legislator, would say, almost verbatim, how is it possible that I have lived in the state of New Mexico my entire life and I know nothing about this? And then we would be introduced to more downwinders who would say, oh, that explains my family history. So we are living in a state of profound denial in the state of New Mexico because of our ties to the nuclear weapons industry. And at a time when our government, as a result of the previous presidents, most assuredly George W. Bush and Trump, are now investing more and more money into the nuclear weapons industry at a time when we should be talking seriously about dismantling them. I did years of testifying against Lanel and talked about the need to transform the labs. The great worry in this state is that if we lose the labs, we're going to lose the middle class. How many politicians have you heard say there would be no middle class in northern New Mexico without LANL, which is not true. And so we are in a position now of saying, are we as the people of New Mexico going to take a stand against this, or are we once again going to find ourselves being used as a sacrifice zone for the nuclear weapons industry? I hope we can talk more about the fact that in New Mexico, we are the cradle to grave experience of the nuclear weapons industry. Our indigenous people mine the uranium, and may I say, indigenous people who were taught by their ancestors for millennia, do not take this substance out of the earth. It is dangerous. And so they would not touch it until the government and the mining companies came and told them, this is going to be prosperity like you've never seen it if you will help us to mine this substance. So we begin with the uranium miners like Leslie Begay, who is an activist with the Southwest Uranium Miners Coalition, who just had a double lung transplant after many of us had to rally to insist that the hospital that turned him down for what can only be labeled racist reasons finally convinced him to get that double lung transplant. And he is now back in DC on a regular basis continuing to advocate for his people and for all of us. From that, through the production and manufacture and design, through the testing of Trinity, which, by the way, was the first nuclear bomb that our government used on a civilian population. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were later. And then now being the sacrifice zone where we're going to store nuclear waste from around the country. Now, I just want you to pause for a moment and imagine trains and 18-wheelers traveling across this country on our infrastructure with nuclear waste and bringing it to New Mexico.
So
this is the plan.
How do we begin to get there, though? That's our history, but the question is, how do we get to the place of nuclear disarmament?
I'm so glad you asked. So the way that we do that is we begin by acknowledging what has actually happened to us by this industry. And I'm sure that I'm over 3 minutes, but if you're going to let me talk, I'm going to keep talking. Because we have already done incredible work in this state. We see the Veterans for Peace. I see the Los Angeles Study Group, Nuclear Watch. There are others. And the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium, which I've been working with now for 7 years, which was established by Tina Cordova and Fred Tyler some 17 years ago. And how did it get started? It got started the way we all need to get started now. Tina Cordova asked a question, why? Why are members of my family, my church, my community at large dying from rare forms of cancer? Why is this epidemic destroying my community and my culture? And she has dedicated her life since then to answering that question. She found Fred Tyler, who was also asking that question. They came together and formed the TBDC, and there are many people here right now who've been working on that. Their immediate goal is the expansion and extension of the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which was created in 1990 to address the impact of radiation on the people who were contaminated by the Nevada tests for all those years. And in 1990, our two senators were Senator Pink Domenici and Senator Jeff Bingaman. We have asked, of course Domenici has passed away, we asked Jeff Bingaman, why did you not include New Mexico in the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act in 1990? And you know what he said? We didn't know. So when I say to you that there are people living in this state their entire lives who have no idea, the impact of this nuclear weapons industry, either by choice or by denial, it is very real. And I think one of the ways we begin is by learning, getting engaged, and addressing how this one state has been impacted by this industry. Tina has partnered with journalists from Japan, from Nagasaki and Hiroshima, who come to our events in Tularosa every year because they feel like they're in solidarity with the people of New Mexico because of their work.
Thank you. Thank you. Who would like to go next? Any takers? Would you like to? Please? Go ahead.
Thank you. Education is key, and I think I think Archbishop Wester has done us an incredible gift by putting together this statement, because it includes not only faith statements and that can be well understood by no matter what brand of Christian one might be, but it also includes that kind of education that Holly was just talking about, in terms of what is the impact of the nuclear industry on the state of New Mexico, what is both long-term, short-term, birth or cradle to grave. And I think that as a local church pastor, that any of our faith communities, any of our spiritual communities, whether they're Christian or Buddhist or Indigenous or any of those communities, could benefit greatly from doing study groups with this kind of information and disseminating that information. Because I do think that education and letting people know what's gone on, not just in New Mexico. I grew up in Arizona. It's gone on in Arizona as well. The air doesn't change once you go across either the Arizona or New Mexico border. A second thing I think, though, Anne, in response to the question, also goes back to both what Regis and also Joan emphasized, and that is being peace. Helping people know that nuclear disarmament is part of a whole continuum of how it is we regard life, how it is we regard peace, whatever the peace tradition is of our particular tradition. Whether it's, as you pointed out, Joan, Thich Nhat Hanh's being peace, and that it is an internal exercise, discipline, whatever we want to call it, or as you were saying, Regis, that kind of how it is we greet the other, and that it won't work if it's only on a policy level. It also has to be on a spiritual and faith level, and that Archbishop, I was very struck in your statement. I mean, I think I know the Bible pretty well. I think I know Jesus' life pretty well, but until I read it in your statement, that the very last thing Jesus said to his disciples was, "Put down your weapons." You shamed me. I mean, I thought I had all this education, but that struck me. And that alone could be a theme for any of our Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox congregations, certainly during the season of Lent, that the very last thing Jesus of Nazareth said to those disciples was, "Put down your weapons." What a place to begin.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I don't want to belabor the points made, but I think we have to do a better job at a number of things. One is to do a better job at sharing our story. It cannot be an isolated act of activism with the downwinders. It cannot be an independent and isolated act of advocacy for the uranium tailings and legacies and impact to Navajo miners. It cannot be an isolated act, independent of everything else, with the impacts to all of the indigenous pueblos downstream from the national laboratories. We have to act to a higher degree our collective advocacy, to move forward, to do a better job at telling our story in ways that the rest of the country can appreciate how we must reject being an energy colony for the rest of the country, because the expense and the cost are so huge in what it does to devastate the beauty of the land of enchantment that we all collectively call home. It is a threat to all of us, and we cannot only depend on those who are directly affected to act alone, but we must collectively support where that calls all of us into action. So I spent half of my life in the legislature working on legislation on policy. And we must get at the root cause as an energy colony to move us collectively toward advocacy, to move legislation that compels our congressional delegation to, one, compel their colleagues in Congress so that Congress acts and does what is necessary to effectuate what must be done on an international level. We cannot be overwhelmed that to have the kind of action at the international level, that we don't value our individual activism for collective and critical movement that should involve all of us, young and old, to protect what we love so dearly, and that is our beautiful land of enchantment, cannot become the wasteland for this country.
Yes. Joan, did you want to?
What Holly and Archbishop Wester have done for us, both through their written statements and also their lives, they've presented evidence. They've given us this really powerful sense of history, what we're in the midst of. I'm so grateful for you putting this out in the world and what you have done, Holly, and Reverend Barber, who is just a rockin' guy, I have to tell you. He and I were arrested in environmental protest at the Capitol a couple of years ago, and I thought, wow, you're not going to stop that guy. I mean, he is just a giant in every sense of the word. And Jim Lawson, just incredible. And John Lewis. I mean, these are people who have sent their voices, as Holly has. But sending those voices, transmitting the history, is one piece of the puzzle. Another piece is how we feel. It's this imperative that we feel to expand our moral circle. We're not just living as moral individuals. We are in a community not only of two-leggeds, but we're in a community where also the very air is our relative. The air that we breathe, the water that we drink, the land that we walk upon, the creatures. And it is to have this visceral sense that is soul-shaking, if you will, that we have an imperative to not only act ourselves, but to expand the moral circle as you all have done in your lives, so this becomes not simply a state issue, but it is a global issue. Now, in 1957, I went to Acoma Pueblo and interviewed, don't laugh, I was this young researcher, anthropologist, hired by Alcoa Aluminum. Oy vey, excuse me. That's all right. 57 was a long time ago, to interview people in Acoma Pueblo who were suffering from poker spine disease. And these are the men and women you were talking about. They were pulling yellow cake out of the earth. And as a result of that, their bodies were going through this horrible transformation. And I have to say that, well, forget Alcoa, but thank you, Acoma Pueblo. My experience of sitting with those elder men and women who were uranium miners in their suffering changed my view. It wasn't just the history. It was also the relationship, the connection, what I felt as a person with a human heart. And just as Archbishop Wester went to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so also have I. And to go to the places where these bombs were dropped, where tens of thousands of people were killed, and to sit with Hibakusha and to hear their story and to see the scars in their body, it is beyond the telling of history, it is the being of history. And so I say, for me, as an individual, but also sending my voice today, one, live by vow. Our faith traditions have vows, promises that we take that represent moral and ethical perspectives related to non-harming, and yet we allow harm. And so it is to live by vow, and then it is to expand the moral circle, just as is happening here. So we practice radical inclusion. And the third piece that I think is really critical has to do with cultural bequests. What are we leaving for the future? What are our bequests to a close but also a far distant future? We know that these materials decay in the hundreds of thousands of years. What are we doing? So my perspective is, one, moral sensitivity to perceive deeply, expand the moral circle, and have the moral nerve, just as our friends here have, to stand in principles and to live by vow and to expand the moral circle.
I don't know what I could possibly, what they said. That's what all. I'm very enriched by what we've heard tonight. This is absolutely beautiful. These themes that you've touched upon are absolutely wonderful. I think just to borrow and emphasize and echo what's already been said here, I think that we typically operate in our culture here in the United States out of a position of power, a position of dominance. It's been mentioned colonialization, and that people of color and the poor tend to be become our dumping grounds, and this rich land, this beautiful land, which is so marvelous, that we don't really respect. I think we've lost a sense of humility and a sense of being in awe of the gifts God has given us. This is a beautiful, I know I never forget in reading, I forget the name of the book now, but in reading of the Native Americans, the indigenous peoples here, they don't have, one person was describing to me, they don't have a word for my right side and my left side. They say rather, this, if I'm standing this way, then this is my mountain side and this is my desert side. But if I turn this way, then this becomes, so in other words, they're very much in harmony with nature and with creation. And I think what's happened is we've become disjointed. We're out of harmony. And that's really what peace is. It's to be in harmony and right relationship with God and with one another. And we've lost that because of our need for power, our need for control, and our inability to be to listen to one another, to talk to one another. I find it interesting that even as we speak now, they're having the the meeting on the, the TPNW, the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And I think it ends August 26th. And Jay could give us the exact statistics, but I know that the vast number of countries have signed. The Vatican was among the first to sign it. And these countries have signed it that don't really have nuclear weapons. It's the companies that have the nuclear weapons that aren't signing it. The United States and Russia and China and all the other countries that have these, France, etc. And so I think it's important for us to engage in this conversation. I keep going back to this, that we have to be persistent, we have to be together, as Regis is saying, we have to be congregational, we have to be together as a community of persons. We have to, as you have said to us, Reverend Holly, to share these traditions and our experience and what we know, to ask the question, why? Why are my family and friends dying? Why are they so sick? And what Rashi Joan is saying, to be able to, beautiful what you said. I hope we're taking notes on this. We'll have this, I think, on YouTube later, because those are beautiful points. They're getting to the core of who we are as human beings, and to have faith that this is what will change and transform this very nuclear and war-mongering world of ours, if we can get in touch with this compassion and what we bequeath to our children and our children's children. I think these are the things we have to, and so I think we have to speak truth to power. Here in this state, frankly, I think that it's money that comes in that the legislators like. They like the fact that money comes in, never mind the fact that the money stays in one county, basically. The rest of us, 99%, don't really benefit from it. It's the control issues. It's that I can get reelected because I say I'm bringing money in, or I'm doing this or that, but without regard for the other. And I don't want to criticize any one legislator. I know it's a difficult job. I can do that privately in my room, but I don't want to do it publicly. But I know it's difficult, and I respect that. And I know we have wonderful legislators who do listen, who do want to help us in these regards. So I do know that. But I'm just saying that in essence, we have to be willing. The scriptures tell us we have to be as cunning as the fox and as innocent as the dove. And so I think we need to know what we're talking about, share our stories, and let our legislators and our leaders know that this is not what we want. President Biden, when he has a track record of being in favor of nuclear disarmament. But it seems to me that a lot of our politicians, when they get in the White House or the position of power, I don't know if they walk through some kind of laser room or something, but they change their thinking. And maybe they know things we don't know. I don't know. I know it's not easy to lead. I know those are difficulties. But I think we have to keep pressuring and saying, we the people don't stand for this. We do not want to let this continue and perdure. I remember years ago, I wish I could remember, it was 40 years ago, there's a wonderful woman who gave us a talk in Berkeley. She was a scientist. She had a PhD in science. She was really brilliant. And the essence of her talk was that God has given us human beings precious, precious gifts, the gifts of life, the gift of creation, the beauty of this land, this earth, the universe we just saw, and these latest pictures we've seen from space, the beauty of the cosmos. God has given us this, and we are stewards of this creation. We are stewards of life. God has given us this ability to be stewards. And so what do we give God back in return? We create weapons that can absolutely destroy all of it, ourselves included. That's the essence of being ungrateful. That's the essence of chutzpah, to turn to the Creator and says, our role, we believe in our faith, is to give thanks, Eucharisto, to give thanks to God for what He's given to us. Is this the thanks we give to God and to one another? No. So I think the way to get to this goal of eradicating nuclear weapons is for us to keep telling our story, to keep telling it again and again, especially to speak truth to power, and to come together. And I think something like this can energize us. I just got back from a Pax Christi weekend in Washington, D.C., and Ann was with me. And they kept telling us that this pastoral letter, Living in the Light of Christ's Peace, this movement has rejuvenated many of them, because they've been at this for much longer than I have. And they said it's been a rejuvenation. So you see, just one little thing can make a big difference, and it magnifies this effort. So I think together we can do a lot. We must never lose hope. We must be a people of hope and know that God is working. And I really believe this is a work of the Holy Spirit. I believe that I think God is saying to us, get to work, folks. Don't destroy what I've given you. So that would be my reflection.
Let me just say one last thing, and please don't take offense to what I'm going to say. But we must denounce the doctrines of discovery and the principles of manifest destiny, because that perpetuates the very need and essence of power and control of one group that breeds supremacy as the utmost outcome of those doctrines of discovery. And it leads to manifest destiny attitudes and behaviors. And if we're going to be consistent, we also must denounce that as part of our past, to look to something that is unifying all of us in the way that we share as people of faith. Thank you.
So we see that this conversation is has many branches and is going to be ongoing. This is just one, we hope, of many. We can't cover everything, but you're bringing up important points. I'm going to skip our third question, because I think our third question, some of the members here have some questions for us. Yes, so one of the questions is from someone in the audience. How do we visualize? And this is a question, you can just let me know who wants to answer this. And they asked me to use this mic, that's why I need this back. How do you visualize the first step of eliminating nuclear weapons? That's really that third question. But what is our first step? How do you visualize the first step? Anybody would like to?
Whoever wrote this question, thank you. So I would be remiss if I didn't make my plug about, so back in, what year was that? 2012, Lawrence Lessig was a professor at Harvard, and he coined the phrase dependence corruption. Are you familiar with that term? And he coined it, he was describing the relationship post Citizens United, the impact of money on everything, on our government. And so he was talking about the fact that politicians are now dependent upon the money that they need in order to run campaigns that cost now millions and millions of dollars. The media is just loving this stuff. And so they, in a sense, are owned and operated by whatever special interests or corporations. And of course, this is very important for us to understand right now, particularly with the unfolding of this last week or so, and we have seen candidates who clearly are not serving their constituents, they're serving someone else. But dependence corruption is not isolated to Congress and politicians. In Congress, we also see it on the state level. We see it in our state legislature. We also see it in our faith communities and congregations, that it is difficult to offend a member of your congregation who puts a very nice offering in the plate every Sunday, that they, as a result of being a CEO or a member of a staff or something. Dependence corruption is holding New Mexico hostage. And until we are ready to address that and challenge it really down to its roots, we are going to remain where we are. If you have worked with state legislators and congressional members, it's almost as if they're a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You hear them talk about the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, nuclear weapons, what it's done to us. They're 100% on board. But when you hear them make their campaign speeches or even doing a press release or a news conference, it's almost as if they're different people. They're thanking Congress for all the money they're sending to us for our labs and how exciting it is that New Mexico is going to be at the forefront of this new pit production. Something, by the way, we stopped 10 years ago, and it's back again. So I think for all of us, we're going to need to be looking, if we want to get on the personal level, we need to get on the personal level of looking at how this is impacting, how dependence, corruption is impacting us in our own lives, and then look at how it is also impacting others all the way up to whatever, the presidency. And I think this is, at the root of this is the economic stranglehold that this industry has on the state of New Mexico. And what I want to say to you is 80% of it is a scam, is a myth. When you learn the history of New Mexico and how devastated the people of New Mexico have been by radiation exposure due to Trinity, and how they have spent decades trying to find medical care for their families, they have been bankrupt, they have sold their homes, their livestock, everything. Who would New Mexico be? What would we look like as a state if it had not been Trinity? If the Manhattan Project had not selected Tularosa because, as they said, it was remote, isolated, and uninhabited. That's out of the government records. They did not consult the census of their own government, which would have told them there were indeed thousands of people living in the Tularosa Basin. And then I want to remind you that the plume that was released by the government is a complete fraud. How do we know that? We know that because the government had planes in place who were instructed, ordered to follow the plume across the Midwest, across the Northeast, and into the Atlantic Ocean. And we know from the Kodak warehouse in Indiana, where all of their film was ruined because of the plume from Trinity, which they recognized and reported to the government saying, hey man, you owe us some money. So I want to suggest two things. I was taught that you need to work not just on long-range goals, such as nuclear disarmament. You also have to work on the immediate, urgent demands, and I am suggesting that you do both. And the way to get really involved for New Mexico is to take advantage of the 2-year extension for the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act that we have just won, and it was won by TBDC. Get to work and get this passed. It will be transformational for New Mexico, for the people of Utah, Idaho, Montana, and some folks in Arizona. So please join us in this campaign.
If I would imagine you would be willing to speak to participants if you want to know more about those campaigns. There are a couple other questions I want to get. There's so many and good ones, but we can't do them all. There are two that I think kind of rise to the top for me. One is, how do we answer the objection that Russia might not have invaded Ukraine if Ukraine had nuclear weapons? And I think this gets at the, if I have nuclear weapons, it's a deterrent to somebody else, to another country. How do we answer that? How do we talk about the falsehood, really, of deterrence? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
If I may have the prerogative, I'd like to ask Jay Coughlin is with us tonight of Nuke Watch New Mexico. Jay is an expert on these matters, and Jay, could you just give a little, because there's some very important thoughts about this.
The Archbishop is picking on me. So the question, restate the question, because it was about Ukraine and if it had nuclear weapons. Is that correct?
How would you answer the objection? So how would you talk to somebody who says, well, Russia might not have invaded Ukraine had Ukraine had nuclear weapons, which they don't?
Okay, obviously a very tough question, but first of all, those were not Ukrainian nuclear weapons. They were Soviet weapons that were placed on Ukraine. And in fact, Ukraine had so many weapons, Soviet weapons, that it would have been the third largest nuclear weapons power in the world. But when the Soviet Union broke up, there was heavy pressure on Ukraine by both the US and by that time it was Russia to have the weapons returned to the boundaries of Russia. And if you could imagine, had Ukraine hung on to those weapons, there would have been universal opprobrium and much geopolitical pressure against Ukraine. In addition, Ukraine did not have the indigenous superstructure to support those weapons. And again, they were under the command and control of the Soviets. So really, my answer to that question is, Ukraine never had those weapons to begin with. It was an artifact of the Cold War. It was very much a victory, a huge thing that Ukraine gave them up, and so did at the time Kazakhstan and Belarus. So it was the biggest single steps towards disarmament so far. Now, look at the way it's going nowadays. We can flip the argument that Russia is shielded from retribution, is able to get away with its invasion of Ukraine because it has nuclear weapons. And Biden has so stated, you know, he's pretty explicit about that. But my point, and I know I can't go on too long, my point is deterrence has been flipped on its head. It actually allowed Russia to do this war. So this just goes to show we got to strive for universal, verifiable disarmament. Now, since the Archbishop picked on me, I want to return the favor and just say it's so wonderful what he is doing, sitting here in this cathedral, becoming a gateway towards nuclear disarmament, when, as he put it, it was less than 100 footsteps away. That was the gateway to the nuclear arms race. So I want to thank the Archbishop and everybody else on this panel.
Again, we have so many questions, and this is such an urgent and important topic, but I'm aware of the time, and I do want to ask one question, if you'll humor me, because I think this is connected to our weekend, Archbishop, that we were just at with Pax Christi. This question says, what are some ways, this gets it to the personal, because as Holly talked about and Regis talked about a bit, there are actions that we must do, you know, macro work. I say as a social worker, we have to change the systems with legislation, but we also need to work on our hearts, which is what you, Joan, pointed to so beautifully, that the conversion has to happen here. So this question is about that, and I want to ask you, Archbishop, if you might respond to this, thinking about nonviolence. What are some of the ways we can get past our reactions, the violent reactions? I'm going to add to that. That person didn't say that, but our reactions, our violent reactions, and see the humanity of our so-called opponents. You see where that's going? So, what are some ways in which we can get past our reactions, our violent reactions, or angry reactions, and see the humanity of our so-called opponents? And I'd like to have that as our final question for the evening, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, this came up at the weekend because it was really Pax Christi is a group for promote nonviolence. And it certainly does have that personal. I came back on the plane resolved to control my temper on I-25. I have a long way to go yet. It's amazing what I-25 can do to a person. But anyway, I think it does have to be personal, obviously. I think part of it is I have to see the good in everybody. We become accustomed to judging each other, putting each other in cubby holes and stereotypes. We dehumanize each other, and that's how we're allowed to do terrible things to one another. Once we've dehumanized the person, then, and that's really what the doctrine of discovery did. It basically dehumanized whole groups of people in the world and said, yes, we have the right to take over their land. We have the right to do what we want to them, and it's okay to do. So I think that we have to stop doing that for one thing and see the good in everybody. Even as I'm so blessed to see the different traditions and religions represented at this table, we have much more in common than we have that unites us than divides us. And yet we spend more time on the divisions oftentimes than what unites us. In San Francisco, my San Francisco life, I spent 8 years in a Buddhist Zen Catholic dialogue. It was a beautiful, beautiful opportunity to see the good in our traditions and how much we have in common. I think the second thing is we have to start seeing the good in ourselves. I think most of the times we lash out violently is because we do it out of fear that someone's surpassing us, that we're being put down. I think we have to start helping people to feel good about themselves. Ours is a celebrity culture where we idolize people, put them on a pedestal because they're perfect, with perfect teeth and perfect hair and perfect bodies, and we somehow bought into that. And so it's just not true. We have to feel good about it. People, they set up, I heard a talk on millennials, you can't say just about millennials, but everybody are very much, they have a lot of self-reassurance, but they're lacking in self-confidence. And I think that's true of all of us to a degree. But if we can see the good in ourselves, then I think we can start to really live in peace and be nonviolent. One of the interesting things that came up in Pax Christi that was nuclear armaments are racist. And I never thought about that before. Racist, that there is based on basically white supremacy. And that the nuclear armaments that we have keep, basically the white culture in control, and they aren't, because, again, has been brought out here, many of the poor people and people of color are the ones that are hurt most by nuclear detritus, nuclear radiation, and ultimately we had a thermonuclear war by wiping out the whole planet. So I think that's another thing we have to, what is racism, but objectifying people and putting them down and putting them in cubby holes and judging them and as all being the same, based on our insecurities. So I think on a personal level, that's, this really is, this whole subject of nuclear disarmament takes in all of this. It takes in racism, it takes in power, it takes in control. These are all issues that which is why it's so difficult, I think, to get traction on it, because we're dealing with these issues. People like to be in control. People like to have power. So I think that really, I hope I'm answering the question, or at least approaching an answer to the question, that these are the issues that we have to start to really grapple with. And it's not easy to do that on a national or international level. And to confront people who are in power with these ideas is not easy to do, and to get people to sit down at the table. And furthermore, there are other issues that we haven't even brought up here tonight. What about terrorism? What about terrorists who have a nuclear bomb of some sort? What about rogue nations, as they call them? These are all issues that we have to take a look at, in looking at this question. So we have to be people of hope, and we have to start with ourselves. The one practical thing I would say to the question, I think Jay would agree, is that on that level of disarmament is we have to continue our efforts to reduce the number. That's the beginning. We have to go well beyond that, as I said, because of the qualitative characteristic of the weapons now being so much more accurate, etc. But I think that's an extremely important first step. And sadly, we backed away from that. Our country and Russia and other countries are backing away from that. And when we had it going in the 70s and 80s, I think we were getting traction. And we did go down from about 50 or 60,000 weapons to about the 13. So that to me is a sign of hope that we can, if we could keep that up, I think that would be an important first step. So anyway.
So we've heard both a call to personal conversion, to examine our own hearts for our own anger and violence, and to begin to transform that, and to tune into others and our own suffering. And we've heard a call to action in our community here in New Mexico, and a call to action at the national level to change legislation and international level. This is no small feat no small call for us. We recognize it's a big call. But I encourage us all to hold all of those together. We can't do this work, the big hard work, without the personal conversion and the personal sustenance that our faith offers. So I want you to leave, as Archbishop said, with hope. Again, this is the first of, we hope, many different kinds of dialogues. We encourage you to be involved in your own dialogues, in your own communities. So we'll see where this goes and where the Spirit leads us in this. So I want to take a moment to thank our panelists for their time, their effort this evening. Thanks to all of you. I know it's a busy time, and you have busy ministries and work, but we appreciate your time and your challenging words to us today. And we hope, again, we will invite you back to some of that dialogue. And thanks to all of you for being with us this evening. And so I want to ask maybe if Archbishop could offer us a brief prayer of blessing as we go to our homes from here and carry this message of peacemaking to others.
I'm going to exercise my archiepiscopal prerogative and ask us to stand. I'm going to ask Regis, as a descendant of the people who first lived on these sacred lands, on the land that we stand on, by the way, and to acknowledge that the land that we stand on right now is sacred land and not ours. It was the land of the native peoples who were first here, and acknowledge the beautiful pueblos that we have the privilege of living with here in this beautiful land. So I'd ask you, Regis, if you would bless us in your native tongue now, tonight, and ask the Great Spirit to give us hope.
Thank you, Archbishop. I'll say this in my language, but to express the appreciation for being blessed with your leadership, to bring everyone here together, and to see each and every one of you, to value your presence and be part of the movement as members of our community when those times call for your presence. As our elders teach us, as members of our community, when community purposes call for your presence, value yourselves to be present when that time calls you as part of community, because it takes every member to create a critical mass. And a first step to visualizing what we all hope for is to see yourself as part of that movement, valuing how much your presence means to that movement, to fulfill our collective sacred trust for peace in your minds, in your hearts, in your families, in your home, in our communities, and around the world. And so I'm going to share that in my language, but I want you to join me spiritually in your mind and hearts to give thanks for the opportunity to be in communion with one another on something so important for the maintenance of a healthy mind, body, and spirit. And especially, our elders teach us to respect. And as I look out to the many elders who have spent the evening talking about something as a gift to the next generation, and that is the spirit of love and respect and compassion. And to all of the elders, we give thanks to your presence for being here on a long evening, but something that we all care about, to nurture that very special, precious gift of the spirit of peace for all of us. Who had the Archbishop? It's a tua sheshka, no, it's a tuita, no, it's a hatitzi, who hatitzi nutrania, such as it's utizitina, it's tua shruan chupist mayani, hatitzi zeha zepo, it's a mashashka, which anitia, it's a amuhan cartridge, it's a hatitzi mark titume. Nutre atsema kutros the mark citium as emanu with kutrum mark citium hatitzi haarstish hatitzi no how na hatitzi cook and haarstish you hatitzi jutro awitra who utisitina kutua chupers to mayani it's a marshal scale which on you do not you go not make a queen not my hatitzi tohina titiko got to a chupers to mayani took us up ko hatitzi ha Gini hatitzi chaos yutzan tika kutats hatmash ihani oitzon hatitzi sananit yutzan hatitzi kutrus hatitzi shatsea tseat yumit shakuya hatitzi kuta. I want to share something that at the end of prayer for our Pueblo people is what we share as we go on our individual ways. And that is, if you all take your hands out in front of you. And when I say chita yutra, bring your hands together to form a cusp and then inhale. Chita yutra. In this way, at the end of this prayer of gratitude and appreciation for all of you, our elders teach us in the end, no matter what walk of life we come from, in the end, we're all part of the human family, to love and care and respect for one another. And so what I offer in all of you sharing our individual and collective breath, that's what you just did. By doing this and inhaling our collective breath, we share the spirit of oneness, of family, of community. And the elders teach us that is the most beautiful gift as human beings to one another, is to share in that spirit. So blessings to you, and may you continue to lead in the courageous way that you do, and to all of our beautiful people who lead your congregations and people and community. Thanks for the shared evening and our shared faith, and to all of you blessings as you journey home. Thank you.
Amen.